the first 10 years of my writing life, which started in my 30s, I wrote about my life at home. And then I felt like I was finally ready to take on a story that in some ways I may have been born to write, and which allowed me to use that sort of unconventional training as an engineer/poet. The Hanford Nuclear Site is the largest environmental cleanup in the world, and it is the most contaminated waste site in our hemisphere. And it's right next door to my hometown, Richland, Washington, where scientists and engineers and laborers all raised their kids while they were keeping the plutonium plants running during the Cold War. And I was one of those kids, and this is the town where my dad and his friends and our neighbors devoted their careers to our national defense, and where my best friend Carolyn's father died of a radiation illness despite years of absolutely adamantly believing that he was absolutely safe. This is the town that I love. My first job out of college was in the hydrogeology unit at Hanford, where we monitored groundwater movement, contamination movement towards the Columbia River. And we used hundreds of wells to get our information. I wanted to write a poem that described that contaminant movement. And I wanted to use poetic form to help tell the story. So I decided to make a poem very long and skinny like a well, and I justified the left and right margins to create spaces between the words that mimic those voids between soil particles where contaminants flow downward. And I think that those skinny lines help your eye move down the page very quickly, which to me is a little bit like the gravity pushing the contaminants down towards the groundwater. I also wanted to use the language of hydrogeology and use it accurately, and to imply that river in the distance and that really the beauty of the movement of contaminants. Plume. For years, it may be locked in the matrix of silt and sand like a photographic image, still and untransported, absorbed and adsorbed, then the introduction of gradient to unsaturated soils, percolation, and it awakens, unfurling like a frond, a carpet unrolling itself, remote, underground. This beautiful movement, fanning between interstices, feathering void to void, describes the dark earth, the layering of permeable and impermeable soils. It is out of our hands, this 50-year-old mistake. This poison, yes, it is moving to the river. Yes, it migrates between grains, down to saturated sediment, manifestly down. And when it descends as far as it can, it will swim, ride droplets like swan boats, float, spread, diffuse, distend, trailing its delicate paisley scarf. And like anything with a destiny, a flock of birds, sperm, breath, it will move downstream to the river. Yes, the river will take it in. Good science requires peer review. Unfortunately, a lot of scientists at Hanford did not really believe they had peers in the outside world, and they didn't really respect the regulatory agencies. And that arrogance, maybe coupled with some misplaced loyalty, allowed them to quote one set of figures to Congress and use a very different set of figures for their calculations at home. I grew up in Richland thinking that we were very safe, and part of that idea was the idea of secrecy. We joked about the secrecy. And I decided to take a piece of text and redact it with the idea that I could twist that message, because what better way to control criticism than to cross out the parts you don't like? As the industrial and public applications of AEC's future operations will be increasingly a public and not a secret matter, the sooner the present clumsy secrecy of health physics techniques is modified, the better, which becomes a trial and no peers. As I was writing these poems, I kept butting up against facts that were just very hard for me to take in. So I would have to go back to the story of Carolyn's father and his death of radiation illness, which would pull me back through these facts again. So that circling around began to feel like, to me, like a process engineer's favorite tool, the flow chart. So I decided to use a flow chart, and like an engineer, I broke it into 3 parts. And part 1, I decided, would be, I would take the body and look at that as a box, and radiation as arrows, trying to penetrate that box. And also I was thinking about the truth and how hard that is to penetrate, as though it's locked inside a box. Flow chart 1. When Carolyn's father died, I drew a box around his death, an arrow referencing my America, my protective box erected in the mind. This is how he died: chromosomal mutation, boiling his blood and marrow, exposure to radiation, an arrow, a flush of arrows. And this was a circle of lamplight, and Carolyn's grown voice on the phone, and the arrow circling back to the box containing his death, containing a box, containing a box. In part 2, I wanted to think about that day that Carolyn pulled out all her dad's exposure records from his entire career. And I especially remember the little boxes he checked on the survey form that said, yes, he did hunt and fish locally, which just meant that his exposure had been increased as well as his family's. Carolyn dumps out on her dining table 30 years of exposure documents, one man's official lifetime dose, painstakingly recorded. Pencil dosimeter readings, whole body counts in cramped cursive, radiation reported in units that keep changing. We study a yellowing questionnaire with boxes her father filled in. How many fish do you catch and eat each week? Where? What kind? Do you hunt local game? Local fowl? Yes, yes, too many, my God, pointing trigger fingers at our heads, charades for shoot me now. And then part 3. One box contains my childhood. The other contains his death. If one is true, how can the other be true? I think at first I must choose a box to believe in, but I'm all American and lightning quick with the shell game. That last part where the boxes morph into shells in the shell game actually helped me understand how I've been coping with this story for so many years. So the engineer in me wants these poems to be precise and accurate, simple, elegant. The poet in me wants that too. Both parts of me want to make something useful and beautiful. Thank you. Thank you.